I've spent most of my life in the outdoors. My name is Ryan Walsh, and at 30 years old, I've accumulated more hours in the wilderness than most people twice my age. It wasn't just a hobby for me, it was a way of life, passed down through generations. My grandfather taught me to track deer when I was barely old enough to hold a rifle, and my father showed me how to read the weather in the way clouds moved across mountain ridges. By the time I was 10, I could identify every edible plant in our region and navigate by starlight if needed. This connection to nature wasn't just about survival skills. The wilderness became my sanctuary, a place where the complications of modern life fell away and things made sense. Every weekend I wasn't working my construction job, you'd find me either hunting, fishing, foraging, or camping. I maintained detailed journals of animal migration patterns, documented changes in local flora, and kept meticulous records of weather conditions. This wasn't just recreation, it was research, a way of understanding the natural world that had become my second home. I built a reputation in the local outdoor community as someone who knew what he was doing. I led wilderness survival workshops for the county recreation department, helped train search and rescue volunteers, and even started a moderately successful YouTube channel sharing hunting and tracking tips. My videos weren't flashy, but they were honest and educational, focusing on sustainable hunting practices and wilderness conservation. Looking back now, I wonder if all that experience made me overconfident. When you spend enough time in the wilderness, you start to think you understand its rules, its patterns, its limits. But what I encountered that October morning showed me how little I really knew. It shattered my comfortable assumptions about what exists in our world and what doesn't. October 28, 2021, started like any other hunting day. I woke at 4 a.m. in my small apartment on the outskirts of Pine Grove, Montana, a town that barely warranted a dot on most maps. The forecast promised clear skies and cool temperatures, perfect conditions for the first week of deer season. I'd been tracking a particularly impressive buck for the past month, carefully documenting its movements and patterns through my trail cameras. My preparation was methodical, born from years of experience. Every piece of equipment had its place in my truck. My trusted Remington .308, meticulously cleaned and sighted in the previous weekend. My hand-loaded ammunition, each round carefully measured for consistency. My hunting pack with emergency supplies, first aid kit, and enough gear to survive 3 days if needed. This wasn't just preparation, it was ritual, one that had served me well for over 15 years in the field. The drive to my hunting spot usually took about 40 minutes, following Wheeler Valley Road through increasingly remote territory. This was national forest land, but I knew it better than some people knew their own backyards. Every bend in the road, every clearing, every game trail, they were all mapped in my mind with the precision of someone who'd spent countless hours observing and documenting the area. The morning started with that peculiar autumn chill that seems to creep into your bones. A heavy dew covered the tall grass in the fields, and tendrils of fog clung to the low spots, creating an ethereal landscape in my headlights. I was running slightly behind schedule. The sun was already beginning to peek over the eastern ridge, burning off the morning mist in patches. As I rounded the final curve before the old private airstrip, little more than a grass runway used occasionally by bush pilots and emergency services, something caught my eye in the adjacent field. About 25 yards off the road, a dark shape stood out against the pale morning light. My first thought was bear. We'd had several black bear sightings in the area over the past month, and I'd even captured a few on my trail cameras. I slowed my truck, already reaching for my camera. If it was a bear, it would make great content for my channel, and I always tried to document wildlife encounters. But as I drew closer, maybe 50 yards out, something felt wrong. The shape turned to face my vehicle, and in that instant, several things happened simultaneously that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. First, My windshield began fogging up rapidly, despite the defroster being on full blast. Then, as if synchronized with this inexplicable occurrence, clouds seemed to materialize over the field, dropping a curtain of shadow over the scene. But what happened next defied everything I thought I knew about wildlife behavior. The creature, and I hesitate to call it that because the word seems inadequate, rose up on its hind legs. This wasn't the awkward temporary stance of a bear surveying its surroundings. This was a fluid, natural movement that spoke of a creature designed for bipedal locomotion. Standing upright, it must have been at least 7 feet tall. I killed the engine, my hand automatically reaching for my rifle case while trying to keep my eyes on the creature. Through the rapidly fogging windshield, I could make out details that sent waves of cold fear through my body. Its head was wrong for a bear. Narrower, with a shorter snout and ears that seemed almost canine in their shape and positioning. But it was the eyes that truly shook me. Deep amber in color, they held an intelligence that felt predatory yet eerily aware. The creature's fur was a dark, matted brown, but unlike anything I'd seen on local wildlife. It seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an almost void-like appearance against the morning mist. Its proportions were a nightmare amalgamation of various species, front limbs too long and articulated like human arms, yet covered in that same light-consuming fur. The back legs had the digitigrade stance of a canine, complete with what appeared to be reversed knees, but the musculature was all wrong, too dense and powerful. What happened next still haunts my dreams. As I fumbled with my camera, the creature let out a sound that defied natural law. It wasn't just loud, it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my skull. The closest comparison I can make is the combination of a wolf's howl and the sound of tearing metal, but even that doesn't capture the otherworldly quality of it. Despite being at least 30 yards away, it felt like the sound originated from inside my truck's cabin. Training took over. I dropped the camera and went for my rifle, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar motions of loading and chambering around. The creature watched this process with what I could swear was calculated interest, its head cocking slightly to one side in an almost human gesture of curiosity. I had a clean shot center mass, just like I'd practiced thousands of times at the range. The .308 round caught it squarely in the chest region. The impact was visible, and blood sprayed from the wound. But what happened next defied everything I knew about terminal ballistics. The creature reacted to the hit, but not like any animal I'd ever shot. Instead of dropping or even flinching, it let out a scream that combined the agonized yelp of an injured dog with the roar of an enraged bear. What followed was something out of a nightmare. The creature moved with impossible speed, zigzagging across the field in a pattern that seemed deliberately evasive. I managed to get off a second shot, but it was already anticipating my aim, somehow knowing where the bullet would go before I pulled the trigger. The round went wide, and the creature disappeared into the tree line, leaving behind only that otherworldly scream echoing through the valley. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call Ben Reeves, my regular hunting partner who was supposed to meet me later that morning. Ben had been my friend since high school, and if anyone would believe what I'd just seen, it would be him. He arrived 20 minutes later, his truck skidding slightly on the gravel as he pulled up beside mine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," were his first words as he stepped out, rifle already in hand. "Worse," I managed to reply. "Way worse." Together we approached the spot where the creature had been standing when I took the shot. The morning dew had been disturbed in a wide circle, and there in the soft earth we found the first physical evidence that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. Tufts of that strange, light-absorbing fur were scattered across the ground, and dark blood stained the grass in places. But something was wrong with the blood. Instead of the bright red of a fresh wound, this was darker, almost black, with a consistency more like motor oil than anything that should flow through living veins. When we tried to collect samples in a plastic bag, it seemed to resist being contained, clinging to our gloves in ways that defied normal surface tension. The fur was even stranger. Each strand felt wrong to the touch, too stiff, too wire-like, and cold in a way that organic matter shouldn't be. Under the morning sun, it seemed to shift colors slightly, from dark brown to something deeper, like looking into a well at midnight. Ben suggested we call his cousin Mike, who worked for the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. Mike arrived within an hour, his official truck kicking up dust as he parked behind our vehicles. He listened to our story with the professional skepticism of someone used to investigating mountain lion sightings that turn out to be house cats, but the physical evidence gave him pause. "I've never seen anything like this," he admitted, carefully bagging samples of the fur and blood. "The structure of these hair follicles, they're not right. And this blood, if that's what it is, the viscosity is all wrong." We spent the next several hours trying to track the creature. The blood trail was sporadic and seemed to defy normal patterns of wounded animal behavior. Instead of following a straight line or gradually curving path like you'd expect from an injured animal, the trail zigzagged erratically, sometimes doubling back on itself in ways that made no logical sense. More disturbing was the complete absence of tracks. Despite the soft soil and morning dew, we couldn't find a single clear footprint. There were depressions in the ground where the creature had obviously moved, but they were smeared and distorted, as if the very earth was refusing to hold an impression of whatever had passed over it. The trail eventually led us to a section of dense forest where the canopy was so thick that little sunlight penetrated. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered this area, and all three of us experienced the same sensation of being watched. The blood trail ended abruptly at the base of a massive old-growth pine, as if the creature had simply ceased to exist. 2 weeks later, Mike called with the test results from the state lab. His voice was carefully neutral as he reported that the fur samples showed genetic markers from both ursine and canine DNA, but in combinations that shouldn't be possible. The blood work was even more puzzling. The samples had degraded in ways that the lab technicians couldn't explain, breaking down into compounds that didn't match any known biological profile. The encounter changed me in fundamental ways. I still hunt, still spend time in the wilderness, but never alone anymore. My YouTube channel now focuses exclusively on hunting safety and group expeditions. I've become hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly scanning the tree line for movement, always listening for that distinctive metallic scraping sound that I know I'll never forget. Ben and I have seen it one more time since then, or at least we think we did. About 6 months after the initial encounter, we were setting up trail cameras at dusk when we caught a glimpse of something tall and dark moving through the trees. The cameras caught nothing but static, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that our breath clouded in the suddenly frigid air. We don't talk much about what happened that October morning. When we do, it's usually late at night, after a few drinks, when the walls between what we think we know about the world and what might actually exist become a little thinner. Mike has officially listed the incident as an unusual wildlife encounter, but I've seen the way he checks his rearview mirror more often when driving the back roads at dusk. Sometimes, on sleepless nights, I find myself going through my old hunting journals, looking for any signs or patterns I might have missed over the years. Were there warning signs? Had similar creatures been living in our forests all along, just out of sight? The questions pile up, but answers remain elusive. I still drive Wheeler Valley Road when I have to, but never alone, and never at dawn or dusk. The local hunters have started sharing stories, whispered accounts of strange sounds in the night, of game cameras found smashed, of deer carcasses arranged in ways that defy natural predator behavior. Most blame it on bears or mountain lions, but I see the doubt in their eyes, the way they grip their rifles a little tighter when the sun starts to set. Whatever I encountered that morning continues to challenge everything I thought I knew about the natural world. As an experienced outdoorsman, I've always believed in following evidence, in trusting observation and experience. But how do you reconcile decades of knowledge with something that shouldn't exist? How do you continue to move through the world when you know that somewhere, in the shadows between the trees, there are things that defy explanation? I don't have answers. What I do have is a deep respect for the unknown and a newfound humility about humanity's place in the natural order. The wilderness I once thought I knew so well has revealed itself to be far stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. And sometimes on dark nights when the wind moves through the trees in just the right way, I swear I can still hear that metallic scraping sound, calling from the depths of the forest, reminding me that there are some mysteries that are better left unexplored. The sun was setting over the pines as I shouldered my backpack, taking one last glance at the world of comfort and familiarity I was leaving behind. At 19, I thought I was ready for anything, confident in my ability to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did I know, I was about to embark on a journey that would test the very limits of my courage and forever alter the course of my life. I had been looking forward to this week-long camping trip with my fellow Venture Scouts for months. As the only female in our troop, I was accustomed to being the odd one out, but I never let that stop me from embracing adventure with open arms. However, when my friend and tent mate unexpectedly backed out just days before our departure, I found myself facing the prospect of venturing into the mountains alone, surrounded by strangers. But I was a Venture Scout, fearless, resourceful, and ready to prove myself in the wild. With a deep breath and a determined stride, I set off towards the unknown, blissfully unaware of the darkness that awaited me in those silent woods. The campsite was already buzzing with activity by the time I arrived, the air thick with the scent of pine and the excited chatter of my fellow scouts. As I surveyed the sea of unfamiliar faces, it quickly became apparent that I was not only the sole Venture Scout present, but also the only girl in a troop of teenage boys. For a moment, an icy tendril of apprehension slithered down my spine, but I quickly brushed it aside. I had dealt with my fair share of awkward situations before, and I wasn't about to let a little gender imbalance throw me off my game. Besides, most of the Boy Scouts seemed friendly enough, greeting me with warm smiles and welcoming me into their fold, as if I had always been one of their own. As I began to settle into the rhythm of camp life, pitching my tent and acquainting myself with my new companions, I couldn't help but notice one scout who seemed to stand apart from the rest. His name was Danny, and from the moment our eyes first met across the campfire, I felt an inexplicable unease wash over me. There was something about the way he looked at me, his gaze lingering just a little too long, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that bordered on obsession. At first I tried to shrug it off as mere social awkwardness, convincing myself that he was simply uncomfortable around girls. But as the days wore on and his behavior grew increasingly erratic, I began to realize that there was something far more sinister lurking beneath his seemingly innocent exterior. On our second day at camp, the troop leaders announced that we would be embarking on a day-long hike through the surrounding wilderness. As we gathered our gear and prepared to set off, I found myself paired with none other than Danny himself. My heart sank as he sidled up beside me, his face splitting into a grin that was just a little too wide, his eyes sparkling with a manic energy that set my nerves on edge. But I was a Venture Scout, and I wasn't about to let some scrawny, wild-eyed boy intimidate me. I squared my shoulders and met his gaze head-on, determined to show him that I was not someone to be trifled with. As we set off down the trail, Danny's attempts at conversation quickly took a disturbing turn. He peppered me with invasive questions about my age, my home life, and my relationships, his voice dripping with a sickening sweetness that made my skin crawl. When I tried to deflect his inquiries with polite but firm responses, He only grew more persistent, his questions becoming increasingly explicit and inappropriate. I could feel the panic rising in my throat as he began to expound upon the intricacies of BDSM, his words painting vivid pictures of rope burns and bruises that made my stomach churn. I wanted nothing more than to turn and run, to put as much distance between myself and this twisted individual as possible. But I forced myself to maintain my composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. As the hike wore on and Danny's behavior escalated, I found myself growing more and more desperate for escape. His touch became bolder, his fingers grazing my skin with a possessiveness that made my blood run cold. I flinched away from his advances, my arms wrapped tightly around myself as if I could somehow shield my body from his predatory gaze. Just when I thought I could endure no more, salvation appeared in the form of two fellow scouts rounding the bend ahead. Seizing my chance, I quickened my pace and called out to them, pleading for their company on the remainder of the trek. Though they initially hesitated, citing the troop's pairing protocol, one look at my ashen face and trembling hands was enough to sway them. As we made our way back down the mountain, Danny's eyes boring holes into my back with every step, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. As night fell over the campsite, and my fellow scouts retreated to their tents in pairs and trios, I found myself once again alone, isolated by virtue of my gender. The scoutmasters had insisted on placing my tent far from the boys, citing concerns for my privacy and safety. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the rustling of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures, I couldn't help but feel more vulnerable than ever before. Sleep eluded me that night, my mind replaying the events of the day in an endless loop of dread and paranoia. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of movement outside my tent sent my heart racing, my hand instinctively reaching for the hunting knife my father had pressed into my palm before I left, his eyes heavy with unspoken fears. It was in the darkest hours of the night that I first heard it, the sound of my tent flap unzipping, the whisper of fabric against fabric as someone slipped inside. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I peered through the darkness, my eyes straining to make out the figure looming over me. And then I saw it, the glint of eyes in the moonlight, wide and unblinking as they stared down at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. It was Danny, his face twisted into a mask of manic obsession as he loomed over my prone form, his breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed in the stillness of the night. I lay there paralyzed, my heart pounding in my ears as I clutched my knife with white-knuckled fingers, every muscle in my body tensed for a fight. But Danny made no move to touch me, his gaze roving over my body with a sickening intensity as he muttered incoherently under his breath. "Are you there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hammering of my pulse. "I know you are. I can feel you." For what felt like an eternity, we remained locked in that twisted tableau, predator and prey trapped in a dance of fear and obsession. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, Danny was gone, slipping back into the night like a phantom, leaving me shaken and sleepless in his wake. As the days wore on and the nighttime visitations continued, I could feel myself unraveling at the seams. Exhaustion clouded my mind, my reflexes dulled by the constant state of hypervigilance that had become my new normal. I clung to the other scouts like a lifeline, seeking safety in numbers even as I struggled to maintain the facade of the unflappable venture scout I had once been. But Danny's obsession only seemed to grow with each passing day, his advances becoming bolder and more brazen with every encounter. He would appear behind me without warning, his fingers grazing the nape of my neck with a possessiveness that made my skin crawl. He would lean in close, inhaling the scent of my hair with a hunger that bordered on the feral. And still I said nothing, convinced that to show weakness was to invite destruction. I had grown up in a world where self-reliance was the only currency that mattered. where asking for help was tantamount to admitting defeat. And so I suffered in silence, my mind and body slowly eroding under the weight of Danny's twisted attentions. It wasn't until the scoutmasters pulled Danny aside one day, their faces grim with unspoken concern, that I began to feel the first flickers of hope. I watched from a distance as they spoke to him in hushed tones, their words inaudible but their meaning clear. And then, just like that, Danny was gone, sent home in disgrace for reasons I could only imagine. In the days that followed, I tried my best to put the horrors of that week behind me, to lose myself in the simple joys of camp life and the camaraderie of my fellow scouts. But even as I laughed and sang around the campfire, even as I marveled at the beauty of the wilderness around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside me had fundamentally changed. It's been years since that fateful camping trip, but the memories of those dark days still linger in the shadows of my mind. I often find myself wondering what became of Danny, if he ever found the help he so clearly needed, or if he simply disappeared into the world, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But more than that, I find myself reflecting on the lessons I learned in those silent woods, the truths about myself and the world around me that were forged in the crucible of fear and survival. I learned that there is a darkness in this world that cannot be explained or understood, a twisted sickness that lurks in the hearts of men and women alike. I learned that even the most seemingly innocent of faces can mask a monster waiting to be unleashed. But I also learned that I am stronger than I ever could have imagined, that within me lies a wellspring of courage and resilience that cannot be extinguished by even the darkest of nights. I learned that sometimes the only way to survive is to stand your ground and fight, to refuse to be cowed by the shadows that threaten to consume you. And so I carry those lessons with me, a talisman against the darkness that will always be a part of me. I am a survivor, a warrior forged in the flames of adversity. And no matter what horrors the future may hold, I know that I will always have the strength to face them head on, my father's hunting knife clutched tightly in my hand, ready to cut through whatever demons may come my way. I've spent my entire life in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains in northeast Georgia, where the distinction between civilization and wilderness grows increasingly blurred with each passing mile. Our town, barely visible on most maps, sits like a forgotten outpost at the edge of one of the largest national forests in the region. The poverty here is as deeply rooted as the ancient trees that surround us, with most residents trapped in an endless cycle of minimum wage jobs at Walmart, fast food restaurants, and the two aging grocery stores that somehow survive despite the economic downturn. I'm one of the lucky ones. My work as a freelance technical writer allows me to maintain a comfortable living while staying connected to the outside world through my internet connection. It's a privilege not lost on me, especially when I see childhood friends struggling to make ends meet, or watching talented individuals forced to abandon their dreams for more promising horizons in Atlanta or beyond. The massive national forest to the east of our town has always been both our blessing and our curse. Its presence ensures a steady trickle of tourism during the peak seasons, but it also harbors secrets that most visitors never encounter. The hiking trails that wind through its depths are among the most beautiful in the state, though they come with their own set of warnings. Cell phone service disappears about 5 miles in, and the nearest sign of civilization can be hours away depending on your location. The trailhead parking lots tell their own stories of danger. Broken glass sparkles like deadly diamonds in the gravel, silent witnesses to countless break-ins. The locals speak in hushed tones about missing hikers and strange lights, though official reports never seem to acknowledge these occurrences. What's more concerning are the people you sometimes encounter on the Forest Service roads. Individuals who seem to appear from nowhere in vehicles that look like they've survived multiple apocalypses. The idea for our ill-fated camping trip came during one of our regular Friday night gatherings at the Rusty Nail, the only bar in town that wasn't completely depressing. Jacob, fresh from a 12-hour shift at Anderson's Auto Repair, was showing off pictures of his new paintball gear on his phone. He'd spent 3 months' worth of overtime pay on a custom-modified Tippmann A5, complete with a red dot sight and an expanded hopper system that could hold twice the normal amount of paintballs. "This beauty right here," he'd said, sliding his phone across the scratched wooden table, "is going to make me unstoppable in the field." His enthusiasm was infectious, even though Isaac and I exchanged knowing glances. Jacob had always been like this, diving headfirst into new hobbies with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Last year it was rock climbing. Before that it was brewing his own beer, which had resulted in an explosion that nearly took out his garage. Isaac, who'd just finished another grueling week of double shifts at Mountain View Hospital, was barely keeping his eyes open. The dark circles under his eyes had become a permanent feature lately, ever since the hospital cut back on security staff. "Unstoppable, huh?" he mumbled into his beer. "Like that time you were unstoppable at disc golf and ended up stuck in that poison ivy patch for an hour?" The playful bickering continued as it always did, but something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the unusual autumn heat that had been baking our town for the past week, or maybe it was the third round of drinks hitting harder than usual. Whatever it was, when Jacob suggested combining paintball with camping, it didn't seem like the terrible idea it should have. The planning took on a life of its own. I had my F-150, which I'd recently equipped with new all-terrain tires and a heavy-duty suspension system, perfect for navigating Forest Service roads. Jacob had enough paintball gear to supply a small army, and Isaac, despite his perpetual exhaustion, was an experienced camper who knew how to pack for any situation. We spent the next week gathering supplies. The local Walmart's camping section was picked clean due to the church retreat season, so we had to improvise. Jacob borrowed a massive tent from his cousin, an old military surplus thing that smelled like mothballs and cigarettes but could supposedly sleep 6 people comfortably. Isaac coordinated our food supplies with military precision, insisting on bringing backup propane stoves and enough food to last a week, even though we were only planning to stay one night. I focused on the logistics, studying Forest Service maps and marking potential spots where we could play paintball without disturbing other campers or attracting ranger attention. The forest was vast, and I knew there were plenty of secluded areas where we could set up our game without anyone noticing. Little did I know that this attention to detail would later save our lives. The morning of our departure was unusually foggy. I picked up Jacob first. His garage, looking like a paintball supply store, had exploded inside it. 3 markers, thousands of rounds of ammunition, compressed air tanks, protective gear. He'd even brought smoke grenades, though I'm pretty sure those weren't strictly legal for civilian use. Isaac was waiting on his front porch when we arrived, surrounded by neat stacks of camping gear. Unlike Jacob's chaos, Isaac's equipment was methodically organized and labeled. He'd even created a detailed inventory list, complete with backup plans for various emergency scenarios. "You never know what might happen out there," he'd said as we loaded his gear into the truck. Those words would come back to haunt me later. The first sign that something was off should have been the fog. It didn't burn off as the day progressed. Instead, it seemed to thicken, clinging to the trees in wispy tendrils that moved against the wind. The drive started normally enough, with Jacob regaling us with stories about his latest workplace drama, and Isaac occasionally interjecting with dry commentary from the back seat. We passed through the small towns that dotted the highway leading to the forest entrance. Pine Grove, with its single traffic light perpetually stuck on yellow. Miller's Creek, where the general store still had gas prices from 2019 painted on its windows. And finally Shadow Valley, which consisted of little more than a post office and a decrepit mini-mart. The paved road ended at the Forest Service station, which was unusually deserted for a weekend. A single piece of paper fluttered on the bulletin board, a notice about bear activity in the area, dated 3 months ago. The usual trail maps and warning signs were missing, leaving behind only sun-faded rectangles on the wooden board. Our usual camping spots were typically about an hour's drive into the forest, following well-maintained gravel roads that were regularly patrolled by rangers. But as we approached the first designated camping area, we encountered something unprecedented. A massive gathering that had taken over not just our preferred spot, but every official campsite in the vicinity. The church retreat was unlike anything I'd seen before. RVs of various sizes formed a protective circle around dozens of tents, like some modern-day wagon train. Children in matching yellow t-shirts darted between the vehicles, their laughter carrying an odd echo in the thick air. Adults in pastoral collars moved among the camps, some carrying what looked like survey equipment, though I couldn't imagine what they were surveying. We stopped at the last campsite turnoff, hoping to find some space, but were met by a man in a pristine white suit, unusual attire for camping. He approached our truck with an unnaturally wide smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm afraid this area is reserved," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't place. "The entire section, actually. We're conducting an important spiritual retreat that requires isolation." He kept his hands clasped behind his back as he spoke, rocking slightly on his heels. Jacob started to argue that public camping areas couldn't be reserved like that, but something about the man's steady, unblinking gaze made me interrupt. "No problem," I said quickly. "We'll find somewhere else." As we drove away, I noticed in my rearview mirror that the man remained in the same spot, watching our departure with that fixed smile. This is how we found ourselves pushing deeper into the forest than ever before, following increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. The fog grew denser, and the trees seemed to press closer to the road with each mile. Our cell phones lost signal one by one, first Isaac's budget carrier, then Jacob's. And finally my usually reliable Verizon connection dropped to no service. It was then that we came across the turnoff, a narrow track that didn't appear on any of my Forest Service maps. The entrance was partially blocked by an earthen mound and a fallen metal barrier, its official Forest Service yellow paint peeling to reveal rust-colored metal beneath. Tire tracks over the mound suggested we weren't the first to ignore this deterrent. "I don't know about this," Isaac said from the back seat, his security guard instincts kicking in. Blocked roads usually mean blocked for a reason. Jacob, however, was already excited by the prospect of exploring new territory. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure? Besides, look at those tire tracks. People clearly use this road all the time." I sat there for a moment, hands on the wheel, studying the barrier. Something about it seemed off. The way it had fallen seemed too deliberate, too perfectly placed to allow passage while maintaining the appearance of a blocked road. But we were running out of daylight, and the prospect of driving back through the fog in the dark seemed worse than pressing forward. "My truck can handle it," I said finally, shifting into four-wheel drive. "But let's agree. First decent camping spot we find, we take it. No getting picky." As we crossed the earthen mound, I could have sworn I heard a metallic groan from the fallen barrier, as if it were shifting on its own. But when I checked the rearview mirror, everything looked the same as before. The fog swallowed the entrance as soon as we passed it, and we found ourselves on a gravel road that seemed to wind endlessly into the darkening forest. The campsite we discovered appeared innocent enough at first glance. A small creek bubbled nearby, its waters running clear over moss-covered rocks. The clearing was larger than most natural openings in the forest, almost perfectly circular, as if it had been deliberately carved out of the surrounding wilderness. The plywood table nailed to a massive oak tree seemed like typical backwoods furniture, though the blue tarps covering it were newer than you'd expect, their plastic surfaces unmarred by weather or time. As Jacob and Isaac began unloading our gear, I took a moment to scout the perimeter of our site, a habit I'd developed from years of camping in these woods. That's when the oddities began to pile up, each one more disturbing than the last. The trash scattered around the site wasn't the usual camping debris. Mixed among the expected beer cans and food wrappers were dozens of industrial chemical containers. I recognized some from my father's farm supply store. Commercial-grade pesticides, industrial solvents, and chemicals I couldn't identify but whose warning labels made my skin crawl. Many bottles still contained residual liquids that had leaked into the soil, creating patches where nothing grew. "Hey guys," I called out, holding up one of the less dangerous-looking bottles. "I think we should—" My voice trailed off as Jacob emerged from the tree line, his face pale despite the exertion of gathering firewood. "You need to see this," he said quietly, an unusual tone for our normally boisterous friend. He led me to a cluster of trees about 50 yards from our camp. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Every tree in a perfect 30-foot circle had been systematically modified. The bark had been stripped away in precise rings around each trunk, the exposed wood underneath treated with what appeared to be some kind of chemical solution that had turned the natural grain patterns into unnatural spirals. But it was the symbols that truly unnerved me. Intricate patterns carved into the wood that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Isaac joined us, his security guard training evident in his cautious approach and scanning gaze. He pulled out his flashlight, a heavy-duty model he carried during his hospital shifts, and examined the carvings more closely. "These aren't random," he muttered, tracing one pattern with his beam. "They're too precise, too consistent. Look how they line up between trees. It's like they're part of a larger design." He was right. When I stepped back and looked at the whole cluster, the individual markings seemed to form larger symbols that sprawled across multiple trees. The pattern reminded me of circuit boards or astronomical charts, but with an organic, flowing quality that felt wrong somehow. The sound of branches snapping deeper in the forest made us all jump. Twilight was settling in quickly, and the fog had followed us, seeping between the trees in thick tendrils that seemed to avoid touching the marked trees. "We should find another spot," Isaac said firmly, his professional paranoia in full effect. "Something's not right here." But as we turned to head back to the truck, we realized the fog had completely enveloped our campsite. The visibility had dropped to mere feet, and an unseasonable chill had settled over the area. The prospect of navigating unfamiliar forest roads in these conditions was daunting. "It's already getting dark," I reasoned, trying to convince myself as much as them. "We've got weapons, lights, and we're all capable guys. One night here won't kill us." I couldn't have been more wrong. Darkness fell quickly in the clearing, seeming to pool in the spaces between trees like black water. We'd set up our camp with military precision, thanks to Isaac's insistence on proper security protocols. The tent was positioned with clear sight lines to both the road and the creek, our supplies organized for quick access, and we'd established a rough perimeter marked by glow sticks, another of Isaac's security measures that we'd previously mocked but now appreciated. The fire helped push back the darkness, but it also cast dancing shadows that played tricks with our perception. More than once I caught myself staring at what seemed to be movement just beyond the firelight's reach, only to find nothing there when I shined my flashlight toward it. We tried to maintain normalcy through dinner, cooking the elaborate camping meal we'd planned, foil-packed campfire chili that Jacob had spent days perfecting, accompanied by cold beers from our cooler. The familiar routine of camping helped ease some of the tension, but we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was during a lull in conversation, somewhere around 11, when we first noticed the light. I almost missed it initially, dismissing it as a trick of the fog that still lingered at the edges of our camp. But there was something deliberately artificial about its quality, a pulsing bluish-white glow that emanated from beyond the hill that bordered our clearing. "That can't be another campsite," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We didn't pass any turnoffs, and these roads aren't connected to any other part of the forest." The light had a rhythm to it, a subtle pulsing that seemed to match the tempo of a heartbeat. As we watched, the fog around it began to move in unnatural patterns, spiraling toward the light source as if being drawn in. "Could be poachers," Isaac suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe it. "Sometimes they use unusual lights to attract game." But we all knew this was different. The quality of the light was wrong. It didn't illuminate the fog so much as it seemed to pass through it, creating strange refractions that bent in impossible ways. And there was something else, something that took me several minutes to identify. The light cast no shadows, even when it grew bright enough to clearly illuminate the hillside. The combination of rum and curiosity finally overcame our apprehension. Jacob and I decided to investigate, leaving Isaac to watch the camp. We armed ourselves with flashlights and, in a moment of either wisdom or paranoia, our paintball markers. Even though we knew they'd be useless against any real threat, their familiar weight was comforting. The trek toward the light source quickly became an exercise in spatial disorientation. The fog seemed to thicken with each step we took up the hill, but it moved in ways that defied natural air currents. Instead of drifting with the gentle breeze that had been present all evening, it formed distinct patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that held their form for several seconds before dissolving. The marked trees became more numerous as we ascended, their carved symbols seeming to pulse faintly in sync with the distant light. The air grew noticeably colder, and an odd metallic taste filled our mouths, similar to the sensation of licking a battery, but more pervasive. About halfway up the hill, Jacob suddenly stopped. "Listen," he whispered. I held my breath and listened intently. The normal forest sounds, insects, wind in the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush, had completely ceased. In their place was a low, almost subliminal hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. We were perhaps 3/4 of the way up the hill when Jacob tripped over something hidden beneath the leaves. His flashlight beam caught it as he fell, a metal object about the size of a shoebox, its surface covered in the same types of symbols we'd seen carved into the trees. But before we could examine it more closely, Jacob's curse echoed through the trees like a gunshot. The light vanished instantly. The sudden darkness was total and absolute, but in that fraction of a second between its disappearance and when we managed to turn our flashlights on, I saw them. Tall, angular shapes that moved with an impossible fluidity, as if they were folding in on themselves as they retreated into the forest. The image lasted less than a second, but it's burned into my memory. Figures that seemed to be made of geometric shapes that shouldn't have been able to connect to each other, moving in ways that violated every law of physics I knew. Our return to camp was a blur of confusion and mounting dread. The forest had changed somehow. Paths that had been clear on our ascent were now choked with underbrush, and familiar landmarks seemed to have shifted position. But nothing could have prepared us for what we found when we finally glimpsed our campsite through the trees. A figure was methodically moving through our camp, its movements jerky and precise like a malfunctioning robot. It wore what appeared to be Isaac's coat, but the way the fabric moved was wrong, as if it were draped over a frame that couldn't quite maintain a human shape. In its hands was one of our paintball markers, but it held the weapon backward, examining it with movements that reminded me of a child trying to mimic adult behaviors without understanding their purpose. We watched, paralyzed, as the figure conducted its strange inspection of our campsite. It would stop at random intervals, its head tilting at angles that should have been anatomically impossible, before continuing its systematic search. The movement pattern was almost mathematical precise geometric paths that covered every inch of the clearing. After what seemed like an eternity, the figure walked up the road we'd driven in on, its gait switching between unnaturally fluid and jarringly mechanical. As soon as it disappeared into the darkness, we rushed back to camp, only to find Isaac violently ill in the tent, and all our paintball equipment still securely locked in the truck. The decision to flee was unanimous and immediate, driven by a primal fear that overrode any concern about driving in the dark or navigating the treacherous forest roads. We abandoned the tent and most of our gear, grabbing only our essential belongings and throwing them haphazardly into the truck's bed. The fog had grown impossibly thick, reducing visibility to mere feet beyond the truck's headlights. But what truly chilled us was how the fog behaved. It seemed to actively avoid certain areas, creating clear corridors that led deeper into the forest while obscuring the road we needed to follow. When we reached the dirt mound that marked our entrance to this nightmare, we found that the metal barrier had been restored to its original position. But this wasn't a simple case of someone lifting it back into place. The barrier had been welded back onto its posts with precision that would have required industrial equipment. The welds were still cooling, giving off a faint blue glow that matched the mysterious light we'd seen earlier. I didn't hesitate. Using the truck's brush guard, I rammed the barrier at an angle, praying it would break free without damaging my vehicle too severely. The sound of tearing metal was accompanied by an unnatural screech that seemed to come from the barrier itself, a sound no metal should be able to make. That's when we noticed the vehicle following us. It maintained a precise 1,000-foot distance, visible only when the road straightened out enough to see behind us. It never used its lights, but we could see its outline in the moonlight, a dark, angular shape that seemed to shift and change every time we caught a glimpse of it. The pursuit lasted 45 minutes, though it felt like hours. Our follower never attempted to catch up, never deviated from its exact distance, never made any aggressive moves. It simply followed, maintaining that mathematical precision that reminded me of the figure we'd seen in our camp. The fog seemed to move with us, creating a tunnel of clear air around our truck while obscuring everything else. Inside the cab, none of us spoke. Isaac had stopped vomiting but sat rigidly in the back seat, his security guard training evident in the way he continuously scanned our surroundings. Jacob kept his eyes fixed on the passenger side mirror, calling out whenever he caught a glimpse of our pursuer. When we finally reached the paved road, the transition was jarring, like breaking through a membrane into another world. The fog simply stopped at the forest's edge, creating a wall of white behind us. In my rearview mirror, I caught one final glimpse of our pursuer, its form seeming to ripple and distort before melting back into the forest darkness. The drive home was tense and silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to rationalize what we'd experienced. We took a roundabout route back to town, paranoia making us check repeatedly for any signs of pursuit. It wasn't until we were parked in my driveway, the familiar sight of suburban homes surrounding us, that we finally began to process the events of the night. In the years since that night, I've tried to make sense of what happened. The local Forest Service office has no record of a road matching my description, and satellite imagery shows nothing but unbroken forest in the area where we camped. The metal barrier still stands at its original location, showing no signs of the damage we caused during our escape. I've heard stories since then, whispered conversations in local bars about strange lights in the forest, about people who venture too far off the marked trails and return changed, if they return at all. The industrial insecticide bottles have appeared in other locations throughout the forest, always accompanied by trees bearing those same circular scars. Jacob moved away shortly after our experience, taking a job in Atlanta and refusing to discuss that night. Isaac still works security at the hospital, but now carries a camera with him at all times, obsessively documenting everything he sees. As for me, I still live here, still write my technical documents, and still occasionally hike the approved trails. But I never venture deep into the forest anymore, and I've sold my paintball equipment. Some places in this world exist beyond our understanding, operating according to rules we can't comprehend. That night in the Appalachian forest taught me that sometimes the greatest danger isn't in what you can see, but in realizing that what you're seeing shouldn't be possible at all. The forest keeps its secrets, and after what we experienced, I'm content to let them remain hidden in the depths of those ancient woods. But sometimes, On quiet nights when the moon is hidden and the wind moves through the trees, I think about that figure in our camp, the one wearing what looked like Isaac's coat, and I wonder if it's still out there, searching for something in the darkness of the forest. In the desolate expanse of the Nevada desert, an eerie stillness pervades the night, broken only by the occasional whisper of the wind and the distant howl of a coyote. But on this particular night, something is amiss. Along a stretch of Highway 50, a car sits idling on the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking a steady rhythm into the darkness. Inside, a cell phone glows, unanswered texts and missed calls casting a dim light on the empty driver's seat. 50 yards away, a set of footprints leads into the desert, ending abruptly as if the traveler had simply vanished into thin air. This is how it begins. Another strange disappearance on the Highway of Tears. Detective Leah Winters pulls up behind the abandoned car, the crunch of gravel beneath her tires shattering the unnatural quiet. 20 years on the force, and she's never seen anything quite like this. As she steps out of her cruiser, the night air sends a chill down her spine, despite the heat still radiating from the desert floor. She approaches the vehicle cautiously, one hand resting on the holster of her service weapon. The car, a nondescript sedan, is unlocked, the keys still dangling from the ignition. Inside, everything appears normal. A half-empty water bottle in the cup holder, a duffel bag on the passenger seat, a map spread out across the dashboard. No signs of a struggle, no indication of foul play. But then Leah spots the footprints. They lead away from the driver's side door into the vast expanse of the desert. She follows them, her flashlight casting a narrow beam into the darkness. The tracks are clear, purposeful, as if the driver had simply decided to take a stroll into the wasteland. 50 yards in, the footprints stop. Leah stares at the spot, her mind struggling to make sense of it. The prints don't fade away gradually as if the person had been picked up or started covering their tracks. They simply cease to exist, as if the person had been plucked from the earth at this exact spot. Leah radios in the situation, requests backup and a forensics team. As she waits, she canvasses the area, searching for any clue, any hint of what might have happened. She finds nothing. It's as if the desert itself has swallowed the missing driver whole. The morning light brings no answers. Forensics scours the scene, but they find no physical evidence beyond the car and the footprints. The vehicle is registered to a James Thompson, a 38-year-old software engineer from Reno. He was on his way to visit family in Utah and never arrived. As Leah digs into James Thompson's life, she finds nothing out of the ordinary. No enemies, no financial troubles, no reason for him to disappear. Interviews with family and colleagues paint a picture of a stable, successful man, excited about his upcoming trip. Days turn into weeks, and despite the efforts of the highway patrol and local law enforcement, no trace of James Thompson is found. Theories abound. A kidnapping gone wrong, a voluntary disappearance, even extraterrestrial abduction. Leah dismisses most of these, focusing instead on the facts, but the facts are scarce, and as time passes, the case begins to go cold. It's a month after James Thompson's disappearance that Leah gets the call. Another vehicle has been found abandoned along Highway 50, not 10 miles from where Thompson vanished. Leah rushes to the scene, her gut telling her that this is connected. The scene is eerily similar. Car abandoned, no signs of the driver. And the footprints, the same abrupt ending. But this time there's something different. Spray painted on the side of the car are 3 words: Highway of Tears. The phrase haunts Leah. At first, she dismisses it as the work of a tasteless vandal. But as she starts digging, a pattern emerges. Unsolved disappearances, stretching back decades. Always along highways, always with abandoned vehicles, and always, always with those abruptly ending footprints. She reaches out to other jurisdictions, requests files on similar cases. What she receives shocks her. This isn't just a Nevada phenomenon. Reports come in from Washington State, from British Columbia, even as far as Australia. The methods differ. Sometimes it's cars, sometimes it's cyclists or hitchhikers. But the result is always the same. People vanishing, as if into thin air. Leah becomes consumed by the case, spending every waking hour poring over files, chasing down leads. She pins a map to her office wall, marking each disappearance. Red pins cluster along highways like a rash, a spreading disease with no known cure. Her colleagues begin to worry. They tell her to take a break, to let it go. But Leah can't. She sees James Thompson's face in her dreams, imagines his family's anguish. And now, with this new disappearance, it's happening again. She can't rest until she finds answers. 2 months after James Thompson vanished, Leah gets a tip. An anonymous email claiming to have information about the Highway of Tears. The sender is cagey, insisting on a meeting in person. Against her better judgment, Leah agrees. The meeting place is a rundown diner on the outskirts of Reno. Leah arrives early, chooses a booth in the back. She's nursing a lukewarm coffee when the informant arrives. He's younger than she expected, mid-20s at most. He slides into the booth, eyes darting nervously around the diner. He introduces himself only as Alex. Alex tells a fantastical tale of a secret government project, experiments with teleportation, of test subjects taken from the highways, whisked away to hidden facilities. He claims to have worked on the project, to have seen the horrors firsthand. Leah is skeptical. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. But Alex has details, names, and dates that match up with her files. And he has one more thing, a location, a remote facility, hidden in the heart of the Nevada desert. If the answers to the Highway of Tears are anywhere, Alex claims, they'll be there. Leah knows she should report this, bring in backup. But something stops her. A feeling that this is bigger than the highway patrol, bigger than any official channels. If there's even a chance that Alex is telling the truth, she needs to see this through herself. She takes a leave of absence, tells her superiors that she's taking some much-needed time off. Instead, she prepares for a journey into the unknown. She packs her car with supplies, studying maps of the Nevada desert. The drive to the coordinates Alex provided is long, the landscape growing more and more desolate with each passing mile. When she finally arrives at the spot, there's nothing there, just endless desert in every direction. But then, as the sun begins to set, she sees it, a glimmer on the horizon, a metallic glint that shouldn't be there. As she drives closer, the structure comes into view. Low, sprawling buildings, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire. She parks a distance away, approaches on foot. She's almost to the fence when the alarms start blaring. The next hours are a blur. Armed guards, shouting voices, the cold steel of handcuffs around her wrists. Leah finds herself in an interrogation room, staring at her own reflection in the one-way glass. When the door finally opens, the man who enters is not what she expected. He's older, grandfatherly almost, with a kind face and sad eyes. He introduces himself as Dr. Richard Pearson. Over the next hour, Dr. Pearson tells a story that shakes Leah to her core. The facility, he explains, is indeed a government black site. But the experiments they conduct are not teleportation. They're something far stranger. He speaks of parallel universes, of gateways that open up on lonely highways. The people who vanish, they're not taken. They simply step through, often without even realizing it, into another world entirely. The Highway of Tears, Dr. Pearson claims, is one of these gateways, and James Thompson, like so many others, has crossed over. Leah doesn't want to believe it. It goes against everything she knows, everything she's ever believed. But Dr. Pearson has proof. Surveillance footage, readings from strange devices, even artifacts brought back from the other side. And then he offers her a choice. She can leave, go back to her life, her job, try to forget everything she's learned, or she can stay, join his team, and try to find a way to bring the lost ones home. The decision in the end is no decision at all. Leah knows she can't walk away, not now, not when she's so close to the truth. The next weeks are a crash course in the impossible. Leah learns of parallel worlds, of the thin places where the boundaries grow weak. She studies the strange technology the facility has developed, devices that can detect and sometimes even manipulate these gateways. But most of all, she focuses on the missing. The files the facility has compiled are extensive. Hundreds of names, faces, lives interrupted, each one a mystery, a family left in limbo. She pores over the reports, looking for patterns, for any clue that might lead them to a breakthrough. And then, in the file of a long-forgotten case, she finds it, a detail overlooked in the original investigation. A witness report, dismissed as unreliable. But to Leah's eyes, it's the key to everything. The witness spoke of a sound, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And a feeling, a sense of being watched, of some unseen presence. It's not much, but it's a start. Leah cross-references other files, and slowly a pattern emerges. In case after case just before the disappearance, the same details. The hum, the feeling. It's the breakthrough they've been looking for. Dr. Pearson is ecstatic. With this new information, he believes they can build a device, something that can not only detect the gateways, but predict when and where they'll open. The work is feverish, round the clock. Leah barely sleeps, fueled by coffee and determination. And then, finally, it's ready. The device is unlike anything Leah has ever seen. A complex array of sensors and antennas, all controlled by a sophisticated AI. They call it the Pathfinder. The first test is scheduled for a quiet stretch of highway, one with a history of disappearances. Leah insists on being there, on seeing it through. They set up the device at dusk, the desert turning to gold and shadow around them. At first, there's nothing. Just the hum of the equipment, the crackle of the radios. But then, the Pathfinder comes to life. Indicators light up, a steady stream of data flowing across the screens. And then, the alarm. It's a sound Leah will never forget. A high, keening wail, like a wounded animal. The sound of the device locking onto its target. Leah races to the screens, heart pounding. There, on the display, is a map of the highway. And on that map, glowing brighter by the second, is a single point. The gateway. The door to another world. They scramble into action. Dr. Pearson barking orders. They have minutes, maybe less, before the gateway opens. Leah grabs the specially designed probe, a device meant to pass through the gateway and send back data. She sprints to the location, the rest of the team on her heels. They reach the spot just as the air begins to shimmer, to warp and bend in ways that defy physics. Leah can feel it, the hum, the presence. It's like standing on the edge of a great precipice, staring into an abyss. She takes a deep breath, steadies her hand. And then, with a silent prayer, she throws the probe. For a moment, nothing happens. The probe seems to hang in the air, suspended in the shimmering haze. And then it vanishes, winking out of existence like a snuffed candle. Silence. The team stares at the spot, hardly daring to breathe. And then a crackle from the radio. Data streaming back from the probe. It worked. They've breached the barrier. In that moment, Leah feels a surge of hope. For the first time, the highway of tears doesn't seem like an unstoppable force, a mystery without end. They have a long way to go. The data from the probe will take months, maybe years to fully understand. And even then, there's no guarantee they'll be able to bring anyone back. But it's a start. A light in the darkness, a path forward. As the sun rises over the Nevada desert, Leah looks out over the endless expanse of sand and stone. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil, are the lost, the taken, and she won't rest until she brings them home. In a remote corner of the Nevada desert, a car sits abandoned. The engine is cold, the driver's seat empty. In the trunk, a suitcase lies open, clothes scattered by the desert wind. A phone, its battery long dead, lies half buried in the sand. But of the driver there is no sign, only a trail of footprints leading off into the wasteland, ending abruptly as if the traveler had simply stepped off the edge of the world. To the untrained eye, it's just another mystery, another unsolved disappearance in a world full of them. But to those who know, to those who have seen behind the curtain, it's something more. It's a reminder, a warning. The highway of tears is out there, waiting, a door to the unknown, a path to worlds unseen, and it's always, always hungry. As the sun sets over the desert, the wind picks up, erasing the footprints, covering the tracks, until all that's left is the silence, the emptiness, and the road, stretching on into the gathering dark, into the waiting arms of infinity. I still don't know why I decided to go back to the cabin after all those years, but here I was, standing in the middle of the woods, staring at the place that should have been burned down long ago. It was 2003, and I had just left my job as a civil engineer, a career I had spent the better part of 2 decades building. My wife had left the year before, and my kids, well, they were grown and off doing their own thing. The decision to return wasn't made lightly. For years I'd managed to push the memories of this place to the back of my mind, burying them beneath layers of work, family, and the mundane details of everyday life. But now, with my life in shambles and nowhere else to turn, the cabin called to me like a siren song, promising answers to questions I'd long since given up asking. As I stood there, the weight of my duffel bag digging into my shoulder, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The forest around me seemed different somehow. The trees loomed taller, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, casting long shadows across the overgrown path. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, a reminder of the passage of time and the secrets this place held. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. The cabin itself looked much as I remembered it, a weathered structure of rough-hewn logs and a sloping roof that had seen better days. The windows were dark, some of them cracked or boarded up, giving the impression of a blind, unseeing face staring out into the wilderness. As I approached, memories flooded back. I could almost hear Larry's laughter echoing through the trees, see his broad smile as we worked side by side, transforming this dilapidated structure into something we could be proud of. Larry had been more than just a friend. He was the brother I never had, the one person who truly understood me. The last time I'd been here was etched into my mind with painful clarity. It was 1997, and we had just finished replacing the roof. Larry was excited about starting work on the interior, talking animatedly about the plans we'd drawn up together. We'd spent the evening celebrating our progress, sharing a bottle of whiskey and swapping stories around a crackling campfire. The next morning, Larry was gone. At first, I thought he'd just gone for an early morning hike. It wasn't unusual for him to wake up at dawn and explore the surrounding woods. But as the hours ticked by and there was no sign of him, panic set in. I searched the area, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. By nightfall, I knew something was terribly wrong. The police arrived the next day, combing the woods with dogs and helicopters. They found nothing, no tracks, no torn clothing, no signs of struggle. Larry's truck was still parked where he'd left it, his keys and wallet inside. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The search was eventually called off, with the official report suggesting a possible animal attack. But I knew better. There was something else out there in those woods, something that had taken my friend. Now, 6 years later, I was back, standing before the cabin that held so many memories and unanswered questions. I didn't know what I hoped to find, but I knew I couldn't move on with my life until I faced whatever darkness lurked in this forgotten corner of the world. With a heavy sigh, I climbed the creaking steps to the porch and placed my hand on the rough wooden door. The metal of the handle was cold against my skin as I turned it, half expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it opened easily, swinging inward with a low groan. The interior of the cabin was exactly as we'd left it all those years ago. A thick layer of dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners like gossamer curtains. The air was stale and musty, carrying the faint scent of mold and forgotten dreams. I dropped my bag in the corner and took a moment to survey my surroundings. The main room was sparsely furnished. A worn couch pushed against one wall, a rickety table and chairs in the center, and a stone fireplace dominating the far end. To the right, a narrow hallway led to the 2 small bedrooms and the bathroom we'd never gotten around to finishing. As I stood there, taking it all in, a chill ran down my spine. It wasn't just the cold or the damp that made me shiver. There was something else, a presence I couldn't quite define. It felt as if the very walls of the cabin were watching me, holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to nerves and exhaustion from the long drive. There was work to be done if I was going to stay here, even for a few days. I started by opening the windows, letting in some fresh air to chase away the musty smell. Then I set about clearing away the cobwebs and sweeping the floors, kicking up clouds of dust that danced in the pale afternoon light. As I worked, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was being watched. Every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, playing tricks on my mind. More than once I found myself staring out the windows into the surrounding forest, searching for something. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin floor, I had made some progress. The place looked a little less abandoned, a little more habitable. I'd brought some basic supplies with me, canned food, bottled water, a camping stove, and I set about preparing a simple meal. As I ate, sitting at the old table Larry and I had built together, I couldn't help but feel a sense of melancholy. This place held so many memories, both good and bad. I could almost hear the echo of our laughter, see the ghost of Larry sitting across from me, his eyes twinkling with mischief as he regaled me with one of his outlandish stories. But those days were gone, swallowed up by the mystery of his disappearance and the years that had passed since. Now, I was alone in this cabin, surrounded by the encroaching darkness of the forest and the weight of unanswered questions. As night fell, I made my way to one of the bedrooms. The old bed creaked under my weight as I lay down, staring up at the ceiling. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind through the trees outside set my nerves on edge. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It started as a faint scratching, barely audible above the ambient noises of the night. At first, I tried to dismiss it as branches scraping against the side of the cabin or some small animal scurrying about. But as I listened, the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from beneath the floor. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. The scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like something dragging itself across the dirt beneath the cabin. It moved slowly, steadily, from one end of the room to the other. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the bedside table and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The old floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I stood, and for a moment, the scratching stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears in the sudden silence. Then it started again, closer this time, directly beneath where I stood. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What could it be? A raccoon? A possum? But deep down, I knew it was something else, something larger, something that shouldn't be there. With shaking hands, I made my way out of the bedroom and into the main room of the cabin. The scratching followed, moving beneath the floor, tracking my movements. I fumbled with the door latch, finally managing to wrench it open and stumble out onto the porch. The night air was cold against my skin, and the woods around the cabin seemed to press in, darker and more menacing than before. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the ground, looking for any sign of disturbance, any clue as to what might be making that horrible sound. That's when I saw it. A dark shape, slithering back into the shadows beneath the cabin. It was only a glimpse, a fleeting moment before it disappeared, but it was enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. Whatever it was big, much bigger than any animal that should be living under a cabin in these woods. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight trained on the spot where I'd seen the thing disappear. Minutes passed, but there was no further movement, no sound except for the pounding of my own heart. Eventually, the cold night air and the realization of how exposed I was out here on the porch drove me back inside. I locked the door behind me, knowing full well that a simple lock wouldn't keep out whatever was lurking beneath the cabin. Sleep was out of the question now. I spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair in the main room, my back to the wall, flashlight in one hand and Larry's old hunting knife in the other. Every creak, every settling of the old cabin sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through my system. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I made a decision. Whatever was going on here, whatever had happened to Larry, I wasn't equipped to handle it alone. I needed help, or at the very least, I needed to get out of here and regroup. I quickly packed my things, casting nervous glances at the floor every few seconds. The scratching hadn't returned, but I could feel a presence, a malevolent awareness that seemed to permeate the very air around me. Just as I was about to leave, I heard something outside. A low, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It wasn't a bear or a wolf. This was something else entirely. Against my better judgment, I approached one of the windows and peered out into the clearing in front of the cabin. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. At first glance, it looked like a large deer standing at the edge of the tree line. But as I focused, I realized how wrong it was. Its limbs were too long, too thin, joints bending at impossible angles. The body was emaciated, with patches of mangy fur clinging to taut, grayish skin. But it was the head that truly chilled me to my core. It was elongated, almost skull-like, with huge black eyes that seemed to absorb the early morning light. As I watched, frozen in horror, its jaw began to open, splitting its face in a grotesque parody of a smile. Row upon row of jagged, uneven teeth gleamed in the pale light. The thing took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. It cocked its head to one side, those terrible black eyes fixing on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. I stumbled back from the window, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The guttural sound came again, louder this time, and I knew the thing had seen me. There was no time to think, no time to plan. I grabbed my bag and ran for the door, praying that my truck would start, that I could get away from this nightmare. As I burst out onto the porch, I saw the creature more clearly. It was larger than I'd first thought, its twisted body easily 7 or 8 feet tall when it reared up on its hind legs. It let out a shriek that sent birds scattering from the trees, a sound that was part animal, part something else, something that had no place in this world. I ran, my feet pounding against the dirt path that led to where I'd parked my truck. I could hear it behind me, its uneven gait crashing through the underbrush. The truck was just ahead, a beacon of hope in this sea of terror. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine sputtered once, twice, and I could feel despair welling up inside me. The creature was getting closer, its rasping breath audible even over the pounding of blood in my ears. Finally, mercifully, the engine roared to life. I threw the truck into gear and stomped on the gas, tires spinning in the loose dirt before finding purchase. As I sped away, I caught one last glimpse of the thing in my rearview mirror. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its misshapen head swiveling to follow my escape, those black eyes boring into me even from a distance. I drove for hours, not daring to stop, not even sure where I was going. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, what I'd experienced. Was this the thing that had taken Larry? Had he fallen victim to this abomination that stalked the woods around our cabin? As the adrenaline began to wear off and the reality of what had happened set in, I knew one thing for certain. I could never go back there. Whatever secrets the cabin held, whatever answers might be hidden in those woods, they weren't worth the price. But even as I put miles between myself and that place, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The memory of those black eyes, that twisted smile, would stay with me forever. And somewhere, deep in the back of my mind, a voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, the thing from the woods wasn't content to let me go so easily. I drove on, watching the sun rise on a world that suddenly seemed much darker, much more dangerous than it had been just a day before. The cabin in the woods was behind me, but the horror it contained, that would follow me for the rest of my days. The days following my hasty retreat from the cabin passed in a blur of sleepless nights and paranoid days. I found myself in a small motel on the outskirts of a town I didn't know, too afraid to go home, too shaken to think clearly about what to do next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing. Its elongated limbs, its skull-like face, those black, soulless eyes that seemed to peer into the very depths of my being. The sound of its shriek echoed in my ears, jolting me awake in a cold sweat night after night. I knew I should report what I'd seen, tell someone about the horrors lurking in those woods, but who would believe me? I could barely believe it myself, and I'd seen it with my own eyes. The local authorities had already written off Larry's disappearance as an animal attack or a tragic accident. They'd never accept the truth, that there was something out there, something that defied explanation. As the initial shock began to wear off, my mind turned to Larry. Had he encountered that creature on the morning he disappeared? Had he been taken, dragged off into some dark burrow beneath the forest floor? The thought of my friend suffering at the hands of that abomination made me sick to my stomach. But there was something else nagging at me, a detail that I couldn't quite shake. The cabin itself, it had been untouched all these years. No one had been there since Larry's disappearance, yet it felt alive somehow, as if it had been waiting for me to return. I spent hours poring over my memories of the place, trying to recall every detail, every odd occurrence from our time there. Had there been signs that we'd missed? Warning we'd ignored in our enthusiasm to create our woodland retreat? Slowly, fragments began to surface. I remembered the unease I'd felt when we first found the cabin, how Larry had dismissed it as nothing more than woods jitters. There were the strange markings we'd found carved into some of the trees surrounding the property, symbols neither of us recognized, but which we'd assumed were the work of previous owners or local kids. And then there were the dreams. In the weeks leading up to Larry's disappearance, I'd been plagued by nightmares of dark, twisting tunnels and the sound of something massive moving just out of sight. I'd written them off as stress from the renovation work, but now, as these memories surfaced, a terrible realization began to dawn on me. What if it wasn't just coincidence that had led us to that cabin? What if something had drawn us there, lured us in like flies to a spider's web? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. If that was true, then Larry's disappearance wasn't just a tragic accident. It was orchestrated, planned by whatever malevolent force called those woods home. And now it had its sights set on me. I spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance, jumping at every shadow, every unexpected sound. The motel room became my fortress, the blinds drawn tight, the door triple-checked each night. But even here, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was on the fourth night that the dream started. I found myself back at the cabin, but it was different somehow. Larger, more twisted, its angles all wrong in a way that hurt my eyes to look at. The surrounding forest was a sea of writhing shadows, the trees bending and swaying despite the lack of wind. In the dream, I was drawn inexorably towards the cabin, my feet moving of their own accord. As I approached, I could hear something inside, a low, rhythmic thumping, like a massive heart beating beneath the floorboards. The door swung open at my touch, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. And from that darkness I heard a voice, Larry's voice, calling out to me. "Help me," it said, weak and filled with pain. "Please, you have to help me." I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, the echo of Larry's plea still ringing in my ears. The dreams continued night after night, each one more vivid, more terrifying than the last. I saw glimpses of vast underground chambers, of twisted, half-formed creatures lurking in the shadows. And always I heard Larry calling out to me. By the end of the week, I was a wreck. Sleep-deprived and on the verge of a breakdown, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to do something, had to find answers. With trembling hands, I reached for my laptop and began to research. I started with the history of the area around the cabin, digging into old newspaper archives and local folklore. What I found chilled me to the bone. The region had a long history of disappearances dating back to the early settlers. Every few decades, people would vanish without a trace. Hunters, hikers, even entire families who'd moved to the area. The locals had myths about an ancient, hungry spirit that lived in the woods, but these were dismissed as superstition by the authorities. As I dug deeper, I came across an old journal entry from a settler in the late 1800s. He wrote of finding strange carvings in the trees, similar to what Larry and I had seen. The settler described them as doors to somewhere else, and warned that they should never be disturbed. The more I read, the more convinced I became that whatever had taken Larry, whatever I had seen at the cabin, was part of something much older and more terrifying than I had initially thought. But knowledge, it seemed, came with a price. The next night, my dreams took on a new, horrifying clarity. I found myself in a vast cavern beneath the cabin, the walls pulsing with an otherworldly light. Before me stood the creature I had seen in the clearing, but it was different now, larger, more fully formed, its black eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence. And there, held in its twisted limbs, was Larry. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror. "You came back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew you would." I tried to run to him, to help him, but I couldn't move. The creature's gaze held me paralyzed. "Your friend has been most helpful," it said, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams. "But we need more. We need you." I woke up with a start, my heart pounding, the creature's words still echoing in my mind. As I sat there in the darkened motel room, trying to calm my racing thoughts, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The voice in my dream, it had been the same voice I'd heard scratching beneath the cabin floor. Whatever this thing was, it had been toying with me from the start. The dreams, the visions, maybe even my decision to return to the cabin. It had all been orchestrated by this entity. But why? What did it want from me? As the first light of dawn began to filter through the blinds, I made a decision. I couldn't run anymore. Whatever was happening, whatever had taken Larry, I had to face it. I had to go back to the cabin. This time, though, I wouldn't go unprepared. I spent the next day gathering supplies, holy water from a local church, silver crosses, sage for burning. I didn't know if any of it would work against whatever dwelled in those woods, but it made me feel better to have some form of protection. I also reached out to a local paranormal investigator I'd found online. Her name was Maggie, and though she was skeptical of my story at first, Something in my voice must have convinced her of my sincerity. She agreed to meet me at a diner near the forest the next day. That night, as I packed my bags and prepared for the journey back to the cabin, I felt a strange mix of terror and determination. I didn't know what awaited me in those woods, but I knew I had to face it, for Larry's sake and for my own. As I drifted off to sleep, my last thought was of the cabin, waiting for me in the darkness of the forest, and somewhere in the depths of my mind, I could hear the sound of something scratching, ever closer. The meeting with Maggie the next morning was both a relief and a source of new anxiety. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 30s, with sharp green eyes that seemed to look right through me as I recounted my experiences at the cabin. "I've heard stories about those woods," she said after I'd finished, her voice low and serious. "Most of it I dismissed as local superstition, but what you're describing, it fits with some of the older legends." She pulled out a worn leather-bound book from her bag and flipped it open. "There are tales of an ancient entity that lives beneath the forest floor. The Native Americans in this area had a name for it that roughly translates to the hunger that walks. They believed it could take many forms and that it fed not just on flesh, but on fear and despair." I felt a chill run down my spine as she spoke. It matched too closely with what I'd seen, what I'd felt in that place. "The good news," Maggie continued, "is that if these legends are true, the entity can't just take anyone it wants. It needs an invitation of sorts, a willingness on the part of its victim to be taken." "But Larry didn't invite it," I protested. "He would never—" Maggie held up a hand to stop me. "Not consciously, no, but fear, desperation, even a moment of weakness can be enough. And you said you both felt uneasy when you first found the cabin, right? Yet you stayed. On some level, you both chose to remain in its domain." The implication of her words hit me like a physical blow. Had we unknowingly invited this horror into our lives? Had our determination to make the cabin our own somehow given this thing power over us? "So what do we do?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. Maggie's expression was grim. "We go back. We find out what this thing wants, and we try to put an end to it. But I want you to understand something. This is incredibly dangerous. If even half of what I've read about this entity is true, we're putting our lives and possibly our very souls at risk." I nodded, a sense of grim determination settling over me. "I understand, but I have to do this. For Larry and for myself. I'll never be free of this thing otherwise." We spent the rest of the day preparing. Maggie had her own set of tools and protective charms, which she combined with the items I'd gathered. We pored over her books, looking for any information that might give us an edge against the creature. As the sun began to set, we set out for the cabin. The drive was tense, filled with an oppressive silence that neither of us seemed willing to break. As we neared our destination, the forest seemed to press in around us, the trees looming larger and more menacing than I remembered. We parked a little way down the road from the cabin and continued on foot, not wanting to alert whatever might be waiting for us. As we emerged into the clearing, I felt my heart skip a beat. The cabin stood before us, looking much as it had when I'd fled just a week ago. But there was something different about it now, a palpable aura of malevolence that seemed to radiate from its very walls. Maggie pulled out a strange device, something that looked like a cross between an old radio and a Geiger counter. It emitted a low, steady hum as she pointed it at the cabin. "The energy readings here are off the charts," she murmured, her face pale in the fading light. "Whatever's here, it's powerful." We approached cautiously, every step feeling like we were wading through molasses. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe, and I could hear a faint whispering at the edge of my hearing, words just beyond my comprehension. As we reached the porch, the whispering grew louder. I could make out words now, my name among them, spoken in a voice that sounded disturbingly like Larry's. Maggie put a hand on my arm, her grip tight. "Remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Whatever we see in there, whatever we hear, we can't trust it. This thing will use our fears and our hopes against us. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. With a deep breath, I reached out and grasped the door handle. It was ice cold to the touch, sending a shock through my system. The door swung open with an ominous creak, revealing the darkened interior of the cabin. The air that rushed out was stale and fetid, carrying with it the scent of decay and something else, something alien and wrong. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The cabin looked much as I remembered it, but everything seemed somehow off. The angles of the walls were subtly wrong, the shadows deeper and more alive than they should have been. And there, in the center of the room, was a sight that made my blood run cold. A gaping hole had opened up in the floor, easily 10 feet across. The floorboards around it were warped and twisted, as if they had been melted by some intense heat. And from that hole came a soft, pulsing light, and the sound of something massive breathing. Maggie's equipment was going haywire, emitting a high-pitched whine that set my teeth on edge. She fumbled with it, trying to get a reading. "This is impossible," she muttered, her face pale in the glow of her instruments. "The energy levels here, it's like nothing I've ever seen." I barely heard her. My attention was fixed on the hole, on the rhythmic pulsing of light coming from its depths. As I watched, I felt a tugging sensation, as if something were trying to pull me in. And then I heard it. Larry's voice, clear as day, calling up from the darkness below. "Help me," it said, filled with pain and desperation. "Please, you have to help me." I took a step forward, drawn by the sound of my friend's voice. Maggie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "It's not real," she hissed. "Whatever you're hearing, it's not real." But even as she spoke, I saw something moving in the depths of the hole. A shape was forming, coalescing out of the pulsing light. It was the creature I'd seen before, its elongated limbs and skull-like face unmistakable. But now I could see more, could see how its body seemed to shift and change, taking on aspects of the forest around it, of the cabin itself. And in its arms, held like a broken doll, was Larry. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and terror. "You came back," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I knew you would." I felt my resolve crumbling. This was what I'd come for, wasn't it? To save my friend, to make right what had gone so terribly wrong 6 years ago. But even as I thought this, I saw the creature's eyes, those bottomless black pits, and I knew. This was a trap, a lure to draw me in. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "You're not Larry, this isn't real." The thing wearing Larry's face smiled then, a terrible rictus grin that split its face almost in half. When it spoke again, it was with a voice that was a cacophony of whispers and screams. "But it could be," it said. "Your friend is here, trapped between worlds. Join us, and you can be with him again. You can be part of something greater than you've ever imagined." I felt its pull, a psychic force that threatened to overwhelm my will. Beside me, Maggie was chanting something, her voice strained as she fought against the creature's influence. In that moment, as I teetered on the brink of giving in, I remembered something, a detail from one of Maggie's books. These entities, these ancient horrors, they fed on belief. The more you believed in them, the more power they had over you. With every ounce of will I possessed, I forced myself to look at the scene before me, not with fear or hope, but with skepticism. I focused on the inconsistencies, the way the light didn't quite behave as it should, the impossible angles of the hole in the floor. "No," I said again, my voice stronger this time. "This isn't real. None of this is real." The creature's form flickered, its hold on reality seeming to weaken. It let out a screech of frustration, a sound that threatened to shatter my eardrums. Maggie's chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the air was filled with a blinding white light. The creature recoiled, its form dissolving into a writhing mass of shadows. "Now!" Maggie yelled. "We have to seal it now!" She pulled out a small pouch and began to sprinkle its contents, a mixture of salt, iron filings, and other substances I couldn't identify, around the edge of the hole. As she did, I could see the opening beginning to shrink, the twisted floorboards slowly knitting back together. The creature let out one final terrible shriek, a sound of rage and hunger and thwarted desire. And then, with a rushing sensation like air being sucked out of the room, it was gone. The hole closed with a final snap, leaving the cabin floor whole and unmarked, as if nothing had ever happened. Maggie and I stood there in stunned silence for a long moment, our breathing ragged in the sudden quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had filled the cabin was gone, replaced by a sense of emptiness. "Is it over?" I finally managed to ask. Maggie shook her head slowly. "Not over," she said, "but contained for now. We've weakened its hold on this place, made it harder for it to manifest. But something this old, this powerful, it won't stay dormant forever." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread. "What about Larry?" I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. Maggie's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, but the Larry we saw, that wasn't real. It was using your memories, your guilt, to try and lure you in. The real Larry, I think he's been gone for a long time." The truth of her words hit me hard, bringing with it a wave of grief I'd been holding back for years. Larry was gone, had been gone since that morning 6 years ago when he vanished. The thing in the woods might have taken him, but holding on to false hope had been my choice. As we made our way out of the cabin, I took one last look around. The place that had once held so much promise, so many dreams of the future, now stood empty and cold. Whatever magic it had once held for me was gone, replaced by the knowledge of the horrors it had contained. "What now?" I asked as we reached our car. Maggie was quiet for a moment, her gaze distant. "We seal off this area," she finally said. "Ward it as best we can. And we watch. We make sure that thing stays contained, that no one else falls victim to it." I nodded, understanding the weight of the task ahead. "And if it doesn't stay contained?" Her expression was grim. "Then we come back. We fight it again. For as long as it takes." As we drove away, leaving the cabin and its dark secrets behind, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, at having survived the encounter. Grief for Larry, whose fate was now certain in a way it hadn't been before. But there was something else, too, a sense of purpose, of responsibility. The drive back to town was quiet, both Maggie and I lost in our own thoughts. It wasn't until we reached the outskirts of civilization, streetlights replacing the deep darkness of the forest, that Maggie spoke. "You know," she said, her voice soft but firm, "what we did back there, it's not a permanent solution. That thing, whatever it is, it's old. Older than the forests, maybe older than humanity itself. It's patient. It can wait." I nodded, a chill running down my spine at her words. "So what do we do?" Maggie was quiet for a moment, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. "We prepare, we research, we find others who've encountered things like this, and we learn from them. And most importantly, we keep watch." As she spoke, I realized that my life had irrevocably changed. The world I'd known before, with its mundane problems and everyday worries, seemed far away now. I'd glimpsed something beyond the veil of reality, something ancient and terrifying, and I couldn't simply go back to my old life. Over the next few months, Maggie and I threw ourselves into research. We pored over ancient texts, traveled to speak with experts in folklore and the paranormal, and slowly began to piece together a clearer picture of what we were dealing with. The entity in the woods, we learned, was just one of many such creatures that existed in the liminal spaces of our world. They were parasites of a sort, feeding on human fear and belief, growing stronger the more attention they received. The cabin had been a focal point, a place where the barriers between our world and theirs had grown thin. We also discovered that we weren't alone in our fight. There were others out there, people who had encountered the supernatural and dedicated their lives to containing it. We formed a network, sharing information and resources, always vigilant for signs of new incursions. As for the cabin, we took steps to ensure it would never be a threat again. With the help of our new allies, we performed rituals to cleanse the land, erected wards to keep the entity contained, and did our best to erase all records of the property's existence. The forest would reclaim the land, and in time perhaps the memory of what had happened there would fade. But I knew I would never forget. The image of that twisted creature wearing Larry's face like a mask haunted my dreams. The sound of its voice, that terrible mixture of whispers and screams, echoed in my mind during quiet moments. Yet strangely, I found that I was no longer afraid. The terror that had gripped me in those woods had been replaced by a grim determination. I had looked into the face of something ancient and malevolent, and I had survived. More than that, I had fought back. Years passed. Maggie and I continued our work, investigating reports of supernatural activity, helping those who had been touched by forces beyond their understanding. We returned to the site of the cabin periodically, reinforcing the wards and ensuring that the entity remained dormant. And through it all, I carried the memory of Larry with me. Not the twisted version I'd seen in the cabin, but the real Larry, my friend, my brother in all but blood. I remembered his laugh, his enthusiasm for life, the way he could light up a room just by walking into it. In a way, it was his memory that gave me strength, that pushed me to continue this strange new calling I'd found. It was on one of our return trips to the cabin site, nearly a decade after our initial encounter, that I finally found a measure of peace. The forest had almost completely reclaimed the land where the cabin had stood. Nature, in its endless cycle of growth and decay, had erased nearly all signs of human habitation. As Maggie and I finished our usual checks of the wards, I found myself standing in what had once been the cabin's main room. The floorboards that had once hidden that terrible portal were long gone, replaced by soft forest loam and sprouting saplings. And there, in the midst of new life taking root, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. A small plant, its leaves a vibrant green, was pushing up through the soil. At its center was a single, perfect white flower, a trillium, Larry's favorite. In that moment, I felt a presence. Not the oppressive, malevolent force we'd encountered before, but something warm and familiar. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but I knew deep in my heart that Larry was there. I felt a warmth on my shoulder, as if a hand was resting there, and a sense of profound peace washed over me. In that instant, I understood that while the horrors we'd faced were real, so too was the love and friendship that had brought me here. Larry might be gone, but his spirit, the essence of who he was, lived on in my memories and in the beauty of the nature reclaiming this once tainted land. As quickly as it had come, the sensation faded. I was left standing in the quiet forest, tears streaming down my face, but with a smile on my lips. Maggie approached, her expression concerned. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. I nodded, wiping my eyes. "Yeah," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Yeah, I'm good. Better than I've been in a long time, actually." She looked at me quizzically but didn't press for details. After all our time working together, she'd learned to trust my intuitions about these things. As we made our way back to the car, I took one last look at the peaceful forest scene behind us. The cabin was gone, the horrors it had contained sealed away. In its place was new growth, new life. And somewhere beyond the veil of our reality, I knew that Larry was at peace. We drove away, leaving the past behind us, but carrying its lessons forward. There were other mysteries to solve, other horrors to face. But now, I faced them not with fear, but with determination and hope. For I had learned that even in the darkest of places, in the face of unimaginable terrors, the human spirit could triumph. The cabin in the woods was gone, its secrets laid to rest. But the story, my story, Larry's story, the story of all those who stand against the darkness, that story continues. And as long as there are those willing to face the unknown, to stand up against the horrors that lurk in the shadows, there will always be hope. As we hit the main road, heading towards our next destination, I felt a sense of anticipation. The world was bigger and stranger than I had ever imagined, full of both terrors and wonders, and I was ready to face whatever came next. There are places in this world where the veil between the known and the unknown grows thin, where the rules that govern our reality bend and twist, allowing the impossible to become possible. It was in such a place that the Jameson family found themselves, deep in the heart of a vast wilderness, far from the comforts and safety of civilization. They had come seeking peace, a chance to reconnect with each other and with nature. What they found instead would test the limits of their understanding and threaten the very foundations of their world. The footprint appeared like a ghostly afterimage in the morning dew, its shape unmistakably human yet grotesquely large. John Jameson stared at it, his coffee mug forgotten in his hand, as the rising sun cast long shadows across the ravaged campsite. Their supplies were strewn about, tents slashed, and an eerie silence hung in the air where birdsong should have been. But it was that single massive footprint that sent a chill down his spine, a primal recognition that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Whatever had visited them in the night was no ordinary animal, and John had a sickening feeling that their ordeal was only beginning. This camping trip was supposed to be a chance for the Jamesons to escape the constant buzz of technology, to remember what it was like to be a family without the distractions of modern life. John, his wife Miranda, and their two children, Ethan and Chloe, had spent months planning this getaway to Whispering Pines Campground, a remote site nestled deep in the mountains. They had arrived late the previous afternoon, the kids buzzing with excitement as they set up their tents and gathered wood for the fire. As the sun set, they roasted marshmallows and told ghost stories, their laughter echoing through the trees. It had felt perfect, a slice of idyllic family life cut out from the hectic pace of the world. If only John had known then how quickly their peace would shatter. The first sign that something was amiss came in the middle of the night. John woke to the sound of rustling outside their tent, far too loud to be caused by any of the small creatures that called the forest home. Grabbing his flashlight, he unzipped the tent flap and peered out into the darkness. The beam of light caught a flash of movement at the edge of the clearing, something large ducking behind a tree, too quickly for John to make out its shape. Heart-pounding, he zipped the tent back up and lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of something massive moving through their camp. When morning came, the full extent of the intrusion became clear. Their cooler had been upended, its contents scattered across the ground. Claw marks scored the sides of their tents, and there, in a patch of bare earth, was that enormous footprint, toes splayed and heel dug deep, as if whatever left it had been running, or worse, chasing. "John, what's going on?" Miranda's voice snapped him out of his daze. She stood at the entrance of their tent, eyes widening as she took in the scene of destruction. John tried to keep his voice steady, to project a calm he didn't feel. "Looks like we had a visitor last night, probably a bear or something." But even as he said it, John knew it wasn't true. Bears didn't leave footprints like that. As Miranda woke the children and they began to clean up the mess, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest around them seemed too quiet, the shadows between the trees too deep, as if something was lurking just out of sight. "Dad, I want to go home," Chloe said, her voice small and frightened as she clutched her stuffed rabbit. John wanted nothing more than to grant her wish, to pack up their things and drive back to the safety of civilization. But when he tried to start the car, his blood ran cold. The engine sputtered and died, refusing to turn over no matter how many times he tried. "It's okay," he told his family, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "Probably just a dead battery. I'll hike down to the ranger station and get help." Miranda grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his skin. "You can't go out there alone. What if whatever did this is still out there?" John hesitated. She was right, of course. Whatever had torn through their camp like a whirlwind was no mere animal. But what choice did they have? In the end, they decided to stick together. They packed some essentials and started down the trail towards the ranger station, a 5-mile hike that should have been easy under normal circumstances. But with every snapping twig and rustle in the underbrush, their nerves frayed a little more. They were about halfway to their destination when Ethan spotted it, another footprint, pressed into a patch of mud beside the trail. It was even larger than the first, and the edges were crisp, as if it had been left mere minutes before. "It's following us," Miranda whispered, pulling the children close. John wanted to reassure her, to say it was just a coincidence, but the words stuck in his throat. Because deep down, he knew she was right. They picked up their pace, the children whimpering as branches scratched at their faces and legs. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening into a creeping gloom. The ranger station still seemed so far away. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Chloe screamed, and Ethan burst into tears as the growl crescendoed into a roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. "Run!" John yelled, scooping up Chloe as Miranda grabbed Ethan's hand. They crashed through the underbrush, blind panic overtaking any semblance of reason. Branches whipped at their faces, roots threatened to send them sprawling with every frantic step. And all the while, that terrifying roar grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right on their heels. John risked a glance over his shoulder and immediately wished he hadn't. Something was moving through the trees behind them, something impossibly large and dark. He caught a glimpse of glowing eyes, a flash of teeth, before he wrenched his gaze forward again, putting on a burst of speed born of sheer terror. The Jamesons burst into a small clearing, chests heaving, legs burning with the effort of their mad dash. And there, like a miracle, was a cabin. It wasn't the ranger station they had been aiming for, but at that moment, it looked like salvation itself. John didn't hesitate. He raced for the door, praying to every deity he could think of that it would be unlocked. By some miracle, the handle turned under his grip, and they tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. For a long moment, they simply stood there, trying to catch their breath, listening to the sounds of something enormous circling the cabin outside. The walls shuddered as it brushed against them, and a low, frustrated growl echoed through the night. "What is it, Daddy?" Chloe whimpered, burying her face in John's shoulder. "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, stroking her hair with a shaking hand. "But we're safe in here. It can't get us." As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they began to take in their surroundings. The cabin was small and rustic, with a single room that housed a fireplace, a few pieces of sturdy furniture, and shelves lined with canned goods and other supplies. It looked like an old hunting cabin or perhaps an emergency shelter. Miranda found some oil lamps and lit them, bathing the room in a warm, flickering glow. As the children huddled together on a threadbare sofa, she pulled John aside, her face pale in the lamplight. "John, what are we going to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if it doesn't leave?" John took a deep breath, trying to think past the fear that clouded his mind. "We've got shelter, and it looks like there's enough food here to last us for a while. We'll wait it out. Someone's bound to come looking for us eventually." But as the night wore on, John's confidence began to waver. The creature outside showed no signs of losing interest. They could hear it moving around the cabin, testing the walls, scratching at the door. Every now and then, it would let out a bone-shaking roar that made the very timbers of the cabin quake. Exhausted by the day's terrors, the children eventually fell into a fitful sleep. John and Miranda took turns keeping watch, peering out into the darkness through the cabin's small, grimy windows. It was during John's watch, in the deepest hours of the night, that he saw it. The moon had broken through the clouds, casting a pale light over the clearing. And there, at the edge of the trees, stood a creature that defied all reason. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be a grotesque amalgamation of different animals. Thick, shaggy fur covered most of its form, but John could see patches of scales and what looked like feathers. Its face was a nightmare blend of bear and something terrifyingly human, with eyes that glowed an unnatural yellow in the moonlight. As John watched, paralyzed by horror, the creature turned those luminous eyes directly towards him, and then, impossibly, it smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that glinted in the darkness. John stumbled back from the window, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. This couldn't be real. Creatures like this didn't exist outside of myths and nightmares. But the low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the night air was undeniably, terrifyingly real. Time lost all meaning in the confines of the cabin. Days bled into each other, distinguished only by the rise and fall of the sun and the constant, menacing presence of the creature outside. The Jamesons rationed the food carefully, aware that they might be in for a long ordeal. The children were remarkably resilient, turning their confinement into a sort of extended camping game. But John could see the strain wearing on Miranda, the constant fear and uncertainty taking their toll. On what John guessed was the 5th day, they woke to an unnerving silence. No growls, no scratching at the walls, no heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Cautiously, John peered out the window. The clearing was empty, the forest still and seemingly peaceful. They waited another full day before they dared to venture out, half expecting the creature to pounce on them the moment they stepped outside. But the woods remained quiet, bird song and insect hum gradually returning, as if the monster had never been there. They made their way back to their original campsite, unsure of what they would find. To their surprise, the clearing was occupied by park rangers and a search party. Apparently, someone had noticed their car, abandoned and untouched for days, and called it in. The Jamesons told a carefully edited version of their story. They had gotten lost, found the old cabin, and holed up there to wait out a series of storms. It was close enough to the truth, and who would have believed the full tale? As they drove away from Whispering Pines, the children chattered excitedly in the back seat, their ordeal already fading into the realm of adventure in their young minds. But John couldn't shake the feeling that they had glimpsed something they were never meant to see, a crack in the facade of the world, behind which lurked horrors beyond imagining. The Jamesons never went camping again. The mere thought of venturing into the wilderness filled them with a deep, instinctual dread. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howled outside and the shadows seemed to twist into unnatural shapes, John's thoughts would turn to that cabin in the woods and the impossible creature that had stalked them. And he would wonder if somewhere out there in the vast, untamed reaches of the world, the beast was still roaming, waiting for the next unsuspecting souls to cross its path. In the years that followed, the Jamesons tried to put the events of Whispering Pines behind them. They moved on with their lives, focusing on work, school, and the everyday joys and struggles of family life. But the memory of those terrifying days never truly faded. John, in particular, found himself haunted by what he had seen. He spent countless hours scouring the internet for any hint of similar encounters, for any shred of evidence that might validate their experience. He found plenty of stories, tales of Bigfoot sightings, of wendigos and skinwalkers and other creatures that lurked at the edges of human knowledge, but nothing that quite matched the horror they had faced. As time went on, John began to wonder if the creature had been something even more profound than a mere undiscovered species. In his darkest moments, he wondered if they had encountered something truly supernatural, a being that defied not just the laws of nature, but the very fabric of reality itself. He never shared these thoughts with Miranda or the children. He didn't want to burden them with the weight of his obsession, or to reopen the wounds of that long-ago nightmare. But the questions gnawed at him, keeping him up late into the night, his mind churning with possibilities. In the end, the Jameson story became just another unsolved mystery, a strange tale whispered around campfires and retold in online forums dedicated to the unexplained. But for the family, it was a turning point, a brush with something vast and terrifying that forever changed the way they looked at the world. They had come face to face with the unknown, with the primal fear that lurks in the heart of every human being. And though they had escaped with their lives, they knew that they would never again be truly free of the shadow it had cast over their souls. The wilderness, after all, is not just a physical space. It is a state of being, a reminder that for all our knowledge and all our technology, we are still small and vulnerable creatures in a world that is far stranger and more dangerous than we like to admit. And sometimes, when we venture too far into that wilderness, we may find that the things that lurk there have been waiting for us all along.